This video, we're going to talk specifically about the drivers of both demand and supply in real estate. So I just wanted to start off with a high level statistic that is pretty interesting, I think. Uh, of all households in the US, 65% are homeowners. In California, we may get the impression that, you know, owning a house is only for, very rich people because housing costs are so high here. But in much of the rest of the country, housing is relatively affordable. And if you look at homeownership rates in places like Michigan or Ohio, etc., it's going to be much higher than it is in California because the housing there is much more affordable. But on average, 65% uh, of U.S. households own their homes, which means that 35% are renting. Okay, so those are kind of the two options that you have for housing. Either you rent or you own. Um, of those 65% of U.S. Um, households that own, 40% of them have no mortgage debt. So that turns out to be basically the math here is you take 65%, and of that 65%, you multiply by 40-ish percent, and that gives you around 25% of all US households own and have no mortgage debt. So that means one out of four households in America have paid off their houses and they own them free and clear. Uh, that's probably a surprise to a lot of people. One in four, that's quite a high percentage. And even those that have mortgage debt, so of this 65% that own, the amount of home equity is actually pretty large. The We're going to talk about this more in the section on or the module on real estate finance. But if the house is worth $100, the average is people only having $40 of debt if the value is 100. So 40% loan to value is what it's called. So um, overall, you can argue that the real estate market is quite healthy in America amongst um, homeowners. Okay, so now let's talk about the actual drivers that drive this kind of demand. Okay, so at a most fundamental level, population growth is going to, all else equal, increase the demand for real estate. Okay, because if you have more people, you're going to need more houses, you're going to need more shopping centers, you're going to need more places to put the people that are working, office space. You're going to need more warehouse space because those more people are going to buy more things. So population growth is a fundamental driver for all types of real estate assets. Now, how do we measure population growth? Well, there's really two components to growing a population. You have the birth rate, which is just how many children people are having, and then you have immigration. Those are the two ways that a country can grow its population. And then within a country, of course, you're going to have people moving around within the country. So even if you didn't have population growth overall, you could have the people shifting around within your country, creating population growth in certain places and population declines in others. The birth rate, just to keep a population kind of steady state without immigration, is 2.1 ish. So you need each household has to have around a little over two children because two obviously to replace the parents, and then there's people that there's just some level of people that die before having children, so you need a little bit extra on average. So it's around 2 point something. um, a country that doesn't meet that is going to have to basically bring people in through immigration to keep their population growing. Many of the wealthiest countries in the world have for birth rates that are much lower than 2.1. So just some examples. South Korea not only doesn't have a birth rate close to 2, it doesn't have a birth rate of 1. It's actually at point 0.8. Okay, so the South Korean society is going to face some really big issues because their population is basically going to become an inverted pyramid. They're going to have very few young people and many old people. And then eventually they'll just have fewer people overall as the older people die. This is a common problem in many wealthy countries. Japan has a birth rate of 1.4, which is also under replacement, and much of Europe is also under 2. So this is a problem that actually affects wealthier countries much more. So the only way to combat this for many of these countries is to basically encourage immigration to keep their populations growing. The composition of the population is also important in terms of age demographics. So younger people, for example, are gonna have different demands and have different income levels, etc., wealth levels than older people. So you also need to look at how the population is composed of in terms of age demographics. Um, if most of your population or a disproportionate amount of your population are older, uh, that may be good for the real estate market to some extent because you'll have people that have had their whole lives to kind of accumulate wealth. But then they're going to die, and then there's going to be a big gap in demand. So you have to pay close attention to the age demographics too. Okay, so having a lot of people is not necessarily enough. You need those people earning and having income and creating economic activity because as they do that, they'll be able to afford housing, they'll be able to afford to shop, they'll be able to afford to buy goods and services, and that is going to trickle to all parts of the real estate asset classes. Okay, so as you grow your population, you also want to make sure that the income of your society is also growing. And that is going to, if that happens, it's going to create a lot of demand for real estate. Social trends can also affect the dynamics in real estate markets. Uh, Not just social trends, but changes in technology. So here are some examples we can talk about. So data centers. So before the rise of the internet, this asset class of data centers, which are basically huge warehouses full of computers that are kind of, making the internet happen, essentially, that didn't exist before the internet existed. So that change in technology um, basically created this new asset class of real estate. And the amount of data centers is actually very large now. This is not just a small part of um, kind of real estate. It's a significant use of space, and those data centers are massive. They use a ton of electricity, so that's going to affect the demand for kind of uh, power plants and other infrastructure, which is also another type of real estate. Um, so that's that's one example of a technology change that led to a change in the demand for real estate. I've mentioned e-commerce before, where the internet kind of facilitated people shopping much more online, so that really boosted the demand for warehouse space. A social trend that's kind of taken place is work from home becoming more of a trend in kind of business culture. So with that, you have not only a demand decline in office space because now if people are working from their houses, they no longer need as much office space. Companies can now, instead of having office space for 1,000 people, if half their workforce is working from home, they only need space for 500 people. So they won't have to rent or build as much office space. It also changes the demand for what types of housing are in demand, because if people are working from home, they're probably going to want an extra room or office space. So it's also going to affect what types of residential real estate are demanded. It also can create a new type of use. Okay, so you have these WeWork, these temporary offices that are in local neighborhoods where work from home employees can go and basically rent a space for a temporary amount of time and work from there or take meetings there. So work from home has also kind of created these new business models for the use of real estate. And then social trends like divorce rates, single parent households. For example, in 1960 in the US, approximately 5% of all births were uh, to basically were out of wedlock. Okay, so it's only one out of 20 births were to basically unmarried women. Now that is 40%. Okay, so as you have households that are single parent, it's going to change the demands for what types of housing. So you may have more demand for condos and apartments rather than, if you have two earners, um, maybe a house is more affordable. So even something as simple as that in divorces. Okay, so the divorce rate has gone up since you can look back to the 1950s and 60s and compare it to now. That basically increases in some ways the housing supply, because when a divorce happens, one of the first things that typically happens is that the family house is sold and that two new households are created out of one. So, it's something that you may not think about as related to real estate, such as divorce rates and single parent kind of households, does actually uh, affect how much real estate is demanded and also what types. You can also look at the recent trend of people getting married much later and maybe not having kids. This is kind of related to the demographics of fertility rates. This may have the influence of creating more demand for like urban apartments, because now instead of getting married when you're 25 and moving to the suburbs, you're going to continue living in the city and stay there until you're 35 instead, or maybe stay there for your entire adult life. This is kind of new social trends that are going to affect what types of housing are being demanded. In summary, though, you can say that the main drivers of demand in real estate is population, either growth or decline, and economic activity. So employment. If you really needed to boil it down, it's how many people are moving into your place and how much are they earning and how many people are earning. Okay, so if you can just get down to those basic things, that's going to tell you the majority of the picture of what the demand trends are in your particular real estate market. Okay, so we've touched on real estate supply a little bit in the discussion on the real estate cycle. So let's just talk about it a little more. So obviously, the supply of land is fixed. You cannot create more land very easily. Of course, you can dredge up dirt from the ocean, and you can technically add land, but really, for all intents and purposes, it's a fixed supply. And so, what people in real estate development and kind of owners of real estate are trying to do is figure out what the highest and best use is. This is a terminology used in the real estate industry, which basically means where can I derive the most benefit from my particular parcel of land? Okay, so you want to find the highest and best use for a parcel. So, um, in that movie Up, there is that house that exists, and eventually over time it's surrounded by skyscrapers, right? So that house existing as just like, that old house that has just been there for 80 years, is clearly not the highest and best use. The other landowners around that parcel figured out that if they build a high-rise building, they're going to derive much more benefit from the use of that land than just keeping it as a single house. Okay, so uh, the market is always trying to identify the highest and best use for every parcel of land. Now, it's not fully unrestrained because there's a lot of regulation of what you can do with your land. But really, within the constraints that are given by zoning and all that kind of stuff, uh, the real estate industry is there's always people on the lookout for, making an offer to a landowner who's not using their land to the highest and best use, buying it from them, developing it into its highest and best use, and then kind of either holding it or selling it to someone else. So this idea of highest and best use is what leads to the increase in supply because not only is it for the redevelopment of an existing parcel, but if you have raw land, uh, if there's if the rents and the prices for housing, for example, are not high enough, then the highest and best use is just to leave it as raw land. But maybe there's economic activity, population growth, and now the highest and best use of that land flips. It turns into actually being a target for development. Okay, so the highest and best use is a constantly changing phenomenon based on the economic situation of the place, the changes in the neighborhood, the changes in the economy of a particular market. And so this highest and best use is a moving target. You constantly have to be reassessing what the highest and best use is for particular parcels. So you can argue in California, we have all these gas stations, but maybe the trend is moving towards EV vehicles. So maybe the highest and best use for those gas stations is going to be to convert them to charging stations instead. So, this is how trends in society, technology, demographics, etc., are going to change the highest and best use. Even though the land is fixed, we can change the use of land through development. So this is when you have raw land or very undeveloped land and turn it into something useful that you can derive an income from. So, for example, you take some land that's raw, you build a suburban housing kind of sub development, and then you sell those houses. Okay, so that's the process of development of taking that raw land, getting all the government approvals, laying the infrastructure and then building the houses and then selling them. That is the development kind of high level of what a development project is. We're gonna spend a whole module talking about this process in more detail, but this is how supply is added essentially. Um, a sub group of development is repurposing and redeveloping, and this is when you take an existing parcel that had some use before, it's already been developed, but then the changes that we mentioned before in society and neighborhoods and the economic situation of a place renders that prior use as not the highest and best use. Then you need to, you know, knock the building down, rebuild something new, repurpose the existing structures to a different use. Whatever it is, this is the kind of the idea of repurposing, redeveloping. And so you'll on one hand remove the supply of one thing and you'll add supply of the other thing. So, for example, if you had an office building and you said, "Hey, this office building has been vacant for 20 years. Let me convert it to housing." So you're going to remove supply of office space because it's not very economically viable, and then convert it to housing, which is now the highest and best use for that particular building. You can also increase the intensity of use. So what this means is back to that example of the house in Up, where it's just, it's that one little house surrounded by all these high-rise buildings. Maybe residential is the best use for that parcel, but instead of putting one housing unit on there with the one house, it's better to put a high rise and put 50 units there. So that's an example of not changing necessarily the use, but increasing the intensity of the use, and that will also require some level of repurposing, redevelopment, you know, building something new. But it's still adding, i- it's still adding supply to the same. You're not changing the use; you're just increasing the amount of units or space or whatever that is available on that particular parcel. Okay, so one conceptual thing that we need to talk about is stock versus supply of real estate. Stock refers to the total amount of something. Okay, so like housing in America, there's something like 150 million housing units in the United States. Okay, of those units, so this includes houses, apartments, condos, all that. There's 150 million units. Not all of those units are available for people to move into because they're currently occupied. They're being used. They're owned. They're being used for the use of housing people. What really matters is the supply of real estate. This is what determines the price. Okay, it's the amount that's available to transact. Okay, so the stock is the total amount. The supply is how much is actually able to be transacted on. So supply can be added through existing owners. So the stock can be converted to supply by the owner deciding, hey, I want to sell, and then they're going to put either the house up for sale, they're going to put their property up for sale. If it's a commercial property, they're going to rent out a unit. Maybe the tenant moved out, they're going to now put it on the market. That goes from housing stock to housing supply. The other way is to just build more. Okay, this is the other way that supply is added. You're going to create more of it. Okay, so you're going to add to the stock. But when you first build a property, it's going to be vacant. When it's complete, no one's living there, so that's going to be supply. It's going to be available for some new person to use or new like a business to take over. So that's how you increase supply is by creating new stock. Adding supply takes a lot of time, effort, and capital. Okay, there's a big lag. You may have a big economic boom that happens, and a lot of new demand comes to a place. I remember reading about when oil fracking first kind of started in Oklahoma and North Texas and all that. There was a flood of workers who were getting paid a lot of money, and they basically had nowhere to live. They had to bring trailers and, whatever, because even though there was a tremendous demand for housing, the supply was going to take time and effort and capital to add. And so even though that boom happened and, those workers were making six-figure salaries and they had plenty of money to spend on housing, the supply just wasn't there because it takes time to add it. So, there's usually a lagged response, especially in these boom periods where demand shifts very quickly. It's often going to cause the existing rents to go up a lot, and um, that will definitely incentivize developers to add supply. But even if they wanted to, they can't just snap their fingers. It's a process to add the supply.